Nora left us with a wonderful provocation about reviving dreams. And I really see my research taking place with a group of people that are engaged with just that exact project. So before I begin, I should mention that because of the fraud situation in Indonesia, I use pseudonyms for places and people in my work. And also I make use of photographs, as hopefully we'll see when we figure out the tech stuff. And for me, photographs aren't really any objective statement of fact. Really, they're a way I can communicate with the ethnographic research I do on the ground and are a form of visual communication. They're really a way I can share and record my emotive and affective experiences. Beautiful. So I had a change in title for my talk, and today with my quick 15 minutes, I'm going to focus in on what I call land occupation ecology as anti-plantation politics. I thought that might resonate a bit more with the other themes that we've been hearing from, especially yesterday. In 2012, a friend from the Indonesian Forum for the Environment told me to have a look at the Aden volcano in central Sumatra's Bukit Barisan mountain range. And looking from the town of a few thousand people of Casiavera up to the volcano, we see this remarkable rise. Oops, sorry, I'm working with my Mac-only skills here.
Tell me if you need help.
There we go. So we see this remarkable rise in a forest land in the hollow of the volcano. And up above that town, on my first visit to the volcano, I passed through a peculiar gate. It now reads Tanah Ulayat, a term I choose to translate as collective land. It's also translated usually as indigenous land or customary land, but foundational to this term is this idea that it's referred to land that's owned and managed and collective, not individually. And the man showing me around that day, Malin, told me that starting in the late 1960s, this gate read something very different. It read Anita Ranch, marking the entrance to an industrial ginger and tobacco plantation and cattle ranch. It took me a few weeks walking around the volcano to notice about a 20-minute walk past the gate is another peculiar sight, an amalgamation of cement and wood walls. Now today, these wood walls make up a family farmer's home, but for decades, the concrete was the plantation manager's office and barracks. The family farmers, or agriculturalists as I call them, living there told me that they live in this ruins. And Johannes, one of the men that lives in this home, told me that in 1998, just after Indonesia's long-ruling dictator, Major General Suharto, had fallen from power, a group of young men went up on the plantation and demolished the plantation barracks. It was a self-evident statement, Johannes tells me. It is one way we drove out, or mengusir, the company. And for me, the ruins are really a haunting mnemonic of a more exploitative time, right? But also a vivid signal of all the work that the agriculturalists have done to make a new life over the past 2 decades up on the volcano. I came to spend much of my time in Casiavera in and about the plots of land scattered across the old plantation. And we see in these plots, intermixed with cattle, with plots of grass, growing agroforests. You can see here one across. Some of the species growing are sugar palm, there's clove, there's chocolate in here, there's valuable timber species. And I found that about 2/3 of the plots on the old plantation were now this type of agroforest. And they're composed of this diversity of crops, really a remarkable diversity. And these forests were planted on what was once ruined plantation land, bare, exposed soil. So I'm currently working on a book that really looks deeply into the history of how these agriculturalists turned laborers, reclaimed and rehabilitated this land as agroforests. And I think that their accomplishment is all the more remarkable for having emerged out of the long colonial, authoritarian, and now neoliberal efforts to expand industrial plantation monocultures across Indonesia and the world, of course, as we know. But today I really want to focus in, with the time that's left, about this idea of a land occupation ecology that's unfolded up on Aden, or the volcano. For nearly 100 years, the dominant form of social organization on Aden was the industrial plantation, something that I bet we're all pretty familiar with. And by the 1990s, this process of industrialization actually ruined the land, leaving it compacted, salinated, leached of its humus or organic value. So throughout, Casiavera's residents remember that they had been, through a changing history of land control, cultivators of this land. And when the New Order ended, Suharto's regime weakened. After 30 years of totalitarian military rule, they went up by the hundreds to occupy the land. And here I worked with a local Sumatran artist to kind of try to illustrate the changes or the emergence of this occupation ecology. On the left, we have an industrial plantation with workers' barracks, mechanization, and of course, critically, a monoculture, right, growing large areas of one crop. And on the right now, we have this smallholder mosaic, where we see diversities increase, we see people living on the land, we see a broader number of species growing there. And so by developing this kind of smallholder agroforestry, or what some people call agroecology, we see that ecology itself is constituting a counter-politics to this dominant form of industrial development, right? In Castilla Vera, this type of action could be considered an anti-plantation politics. This type of ecology that has emerged really has two components here, and I want to focus in on that now. And key is the linkage of social organization and this form of diversified smallholder production, right? This specific ecology or agroecology, and then their non-capitalist character. But first we need to understand a little bit about what's happening in Sumatra in a broader context. So just for background, as many of you guys know, Sumatra is one of the original sites of industrial agriculture, arriving at the turn of the century, late 1800s, and it now remains a center zone of this now like globally ubiquitous form of production. These are monocultures on a massive scale. In Indonesia, they occur on state land with leases to transnational agribusiness. The production is based on varying forms of compulsion. And I think key for us today is to understand that 3 generations of scholarship have demonstrated the harms of this form of production. In my own field sites, we can see, of course, the ecological changes that happened with the original arrival of one of the first oil palm plantations. That type of ecological transformation or destruction remains more or less the same to the current day. You can see in that middle image in the top, 2016 I took. And that has real impacts for many forms of life, right? Not just the human. Of course, there's the impending extinction of the Indonesian orangutan. And then also, of course, that's highly related with forms of human life and resistance. Arsons of plantation infrastructures are quite common. The militarized repression of dissenters, far too common. And that, unfortunately, a few times a year climaxes in the murder of activists and farmers that are working towards a different way of doing things. Also within this milieu, we have the Indonesian Peasant Union with hundreds of thousands of members, and they're just one of the many mobilization organizations that are at work right now in Indonesia. SPIs, they call themselves, are tightly linked with Via Campesina, the global peasant umbrella movement, claiming over 200 million members. And this Indonesian Peasant Union played a key role up on Aden, supporting the reclamation with multiplicitous forms of organizing. Here we can see SPI flying the Via Campesina banner, occupying their plot of land, resisting their eviction by the Special Forces Police Force of Indonesia. And then you can see the type of images and discourse that's circulating online in the bottom right image, where two of the activists were arrested for their role in this occupation, and they're circulating images that say activist, not criminal, right? Working against that type of criminalization. So with my last 5 minutes or so, I'd like to point out a little bit more about how this went down. And first I acknowledge that land occupation ecologies emerge out of mobilization, right? But they take a certain type of ecological dimension within their mobilization. So whereas protesters started with meetings, discussion groups, and then moved to protesting in the streets, what happened in Aden was the fact that all along these same members were creating tree nurseries. They were planting their land in a form of very sophisticated modern agroecology that they learned and share within themselves at the same time that they were engaged in more familiar forms of direct action, right? And all of this didn't come without risks. Tia, 55, mother of two and one of the largest landholders in Casiopera, told me about one of their formative days of the reclamation. She said, the news spread. The government was coming back. We blocked the road. People carried their air rifles and machetes. We no longer trembled with fear. No, we were not afraid anymore. The people were reckless, or nekat. We were not even afraid of death. And others used this same word, nekat, to talk about the time they began reclaiming Anita Plantation and also planting it, right? So here we see that politics, that anti-plantation politics, and the stakes that are at play at a simple act as planting a tree, right? An act so simple and benign for many that maybe they would laugh when they hear about that as a form of activism. But no, not in this case, right? The letters they wrote, the protests, their guerrilla gardening, these were all forms of mobilization. These were motivated by a very self-aware alternative to the classist, racialized, and gendered abuses that had existed at the plantation estate's founding. When Wanga, shown here, began to cultivate her own plot on the collective land in 2000, it was, according to her, an extreme waste ground. Others had tried before her to reclaim the same plot, but gave up after their crops wouldn't grow. They told me it wouldn't work planting here, Wanga told me. They say nothing will grow, not even grass. Wanga had joined hundreds of others to work the plantation as a laborer. She worked for months as a pesticide sprayer, wearing one of those backpacks that spray out the toxic chemicals. But the pay was too low, she said, and she wasn't free to do anything else. The plantation made the land barren with their tractors and their chemicals, she told me. What's more, during the long decades that Casiopera worked as what they called coolie laborers, actually, which is a Tamil term and points to the connection, the transnational connections of the plantation economy, there was a certain dominant form of social relation that inscribed what James Scott would probably call a certain type of metis, or a monoculture of the mind, right? Doing that type of work, a certain collection of social and ecological knowledge. And so Wanga and the others had to reconstitute and recreate a new form of knowledge, a new form of agroecological knowledge. And hence part of Casiopera's reclamation was about building, was about education, was about traveling and seeing different forms of crop production. These are activities that we don't often associate with activist unions and direct action, right? But maybe looking at our own example here, what happened at Occupy, if Occupy had a vision of how more to fully make use of the spaces that they were able to claim, make those spaces productive in whatever way that meant for them, we would have seen a greater longevity to that movement. Just a speculation, but something to think about when looking at this case. The results of what they did was quite remarkable, and with my last minute or two, I'm going to take you through it really quick. You see here an uncultivated plot, really only supporting grass. Although the grass is useful, they feed it to their cows. And then here you see an agroforest plot now, about 20 years old. This is actually a cinnamon-dominant forest, but it has over 30 species that are cultivated and growing, and it has much of the function of the rainforest up above it. Certainly has greater ecological function, diversity, and value than the plantation monocultures that this place came to replace, right? These weren't spontaneous. They were nurtured, cultivated, manured, and of course harvested, giving us an insight to a certain type of environmentalism that depended on this reconstituted agroecological knowledge, right? And this knowledge continues to deepen, and as these people tend their plots to today. And here we have an emergent smallholder economy based on cooperatives associated with the peasant union. We see a movement trader buying avocados on the land for resale and export. We see a family economy around sugar palm taking place in the evening while they process the sugar for sale. And then we can see on the right some transects of the type of ecology this land occupation has produced, right? A remarkably diverse, economically valuable forest that really kind of mimics the rainforest ecology that people are quite familiar with. And this has an emergent function. Actually looking from space, the impact of these people is visible. Here's the volcano with its caldera, and we have a little black box where the plantation was located. And in 1989, when the plantation was still operating, we see this blue color inside this box. And blue in this Landsat projection is exposed soil. So we can see a degraded exposed soil really throughout the plantation. And then by 2015, more than 10 years after the occupation, precisely where the area was most degraded and most exposed, we have this dark green color representing new vegetative growth, right? So we can actually see this emergent property of this land occupation ecology. It's taking a landscape scale, right? And it's offering, I think, some hope, and as Nora said, maybe a potential to revive some dreams amongst different forms of labor activists and organizers. And it's still emerging, still consolidating. So looking beyond Casiavera, the town of Casiavera and the Aran volcano, we don't really have any count of the number of places reclaimed from industrial production. But Casiavera may be unique. There is certainly more of a need for understanding places where different forms of occupation ecologies and the politics are associated with are emerging, especially among what is now a global agriculturalist movement. And hundreds of thousands of families and activists engaged in land occupations in Indonesia. And my last count, there were probably around 300,000 people living in ongoing occupations in Indonesia. So this landscape is one way of bringing something to an end and creating something new that has interesting agroecological lifeways. A land occupation ecology took hold, right? The changes working against the dominant values of industrial practices and values. This remarkable transformation now provides rural workers momentum and energy. Other activists come and visit. They share their knowledge. They pass it on to others. And their continued efforts to nourish a smallholder economy, I think, really hold the greatest promise for making our world a more livable one. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, all of you. This is fantastic.